Well, if we really want to relieve the stress on our pollinators, there's a lot of different areas that we can target because there is a lot going on. But keep this in mind. This is one of my favorite quotes ever. For every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. Truer words were never spoken. I think the problem, a lot of the reason why you hear such a diversity of interesting ideas online about what's going on with the bees, and why you're hearing a lot of people attribute the entire honeybee die-off to just one factor. People tell me all the time, it's just the pesticides, right? If we can get rid of the neonicotinoids, the Roundup, we fix the problem, correct? It's not just the pesticides. The Bee Informed Partnership has collected pretty much one of the largest data sets that's ever been collected about what's going on with the bees. And in partnership with Bee Informed and the National Honeybee Disease Survey, we know that this is not a simple problem. There's a lot going on here. So any answers, well, they're going to have to really dig into data. They'll have to be data-driven because sometimes, well, take a look at this. It's true. This is real data, everyone. I kid you not. This is an actual data set. And I want you to see just how problematic it can be when you will accept any correlation as a causation of an issue. Because this is one of the strongest correlations. Look at this. Somebody look at this. Do you see this R-square value? Like, do you see this R value? This is amazing. I would have killed for an R value like that when I was in grad school. The highest R value that you can get is 1. And this is 0.93. So that means that as one of these data points changes, the other one changes with it in a very dramatic way. We know that there is a very strong causal link between honeybee colony losses and juvenile arrests for marijuana. And we know that because this data depicts that very clearly. As juvenile arrests for marijuana have risen, honeybee colonies have dropped off. Does everybody see that? Is that clear from the graph? Is this clear from the data? Now, the reason why I show this is to remind people that there are things that are called confounding variables in pretty much every data set. Data is rarely that straightforward that you can look at one graph and know exactly what's going on. And anybody who wants to convince you that they have solved the entire problem or understand the whole issue from just one graph, I wouldn't trust them. Because these matters are multifaceted. Now, confounding variables, you might not know exactly what I mean when I say that, but a confounding variable is something that we say, we talk about in statistics. It's something that can easily confuse you because it's not one of the variables that you tested, but it's hiding in the background and it's influencing both of the factors. So think about it this way. The example that my statistics professor would always give is that there has been a very, very, very strong correlation. It's been shown conclusively and clearly that individuals who go to church more than 2 times a week live substantially longer than individuals who don't. The conclusion that you could draw from that is that church keeps you alive longer. And if that is the case, I will probably live well into my hundreds. My parents are pastors. I have been at church more than twice a week, every week, since I was born. So I'm probably good there. But the confounding variable there is actually that individuals who go to church are less likely to participate in things that we would call risky behaviors. So things like drinking heavily, going to lots of parties, doing drugs, those individuals are substantially less likely, and that matter forms this invisible variable that influences the matters in ways that we don't always see. Now, the confounding variable here is simply time. At the same time, there's a coincidence here. At the same time, a parasite was introduced called the varroa mite. And in the early 90s, it became a huge issue, and honeybee colonies started to drop off precipitously. At the same time, the war on drugs was beginning to reach its peak, and individuals were arrested for possession of marijuana at a much higher rate than they were prior to that. Time. Think about how many things can just vary with time. So anytime we look at a data set, it is important that we go deeper, that we don't just look at a correlation, but we test the hypotheses that are presented to us from that correlative data. All right, so everybody's with me, right? All right, so this might help you understand why I'm always so skeptical when people present the idea that there is just one issue going on here, because the data does not bear that out. The data bears out that there are many. But the individuals who usually get the most excited about saving the bees are often the ones who attach to just one issue. Now, I believe that these are images from a march to save the bees that was related to banning neonicotinoids. I think this march was in Portland. And I love the zeal, the excitement, the enthusiasm to do what we can to save the bees. But we have to be willing to consider there's more going on than just one matter. These people rallied around the problem of the neonics. That's not the only problem. So, what is killing the bees? It is clearly a multitude of interacting factors, and I'm going to go through some of them now. Stop me if I'm going too fast. Now, with what we were talking about earlier, there are our native pollinators and there are the honeybees. And I want you to pay close attention to these little stickers that I have in the corner, because they'll let you know whether these issues are problems for both groups, for the native pollinators and the honeybees, for just the native pollinators, just the honeybees. And most of these issues are problems for everyone. If it is a problem for the honeybees, it is often a huge problem for the native bees as well. Parasites, definitely one of those issues. There are a number of different parasites that want to find their way into a honeybee colony. And can you blame them? It is wonderful in there. Guys, have any of you had the chance to just crack one of them open and look down inside? It is awesome. So first of all, there is as much food as you could possibly want. There's honey everywhere, there's pollen. So any creature that gets in there and is allowed to remain for one reason or another figures out how to crack the code and smell like a bee or feel like a bee. They never have to go in search of food again. They are protected from all predators because the bees usually won't let anything inside and will defend that place to the death. And in addition to that, it is entirely climate and humidity controlled. The bees actually air condition and heat the place themselves. How awesome is that? So parasites really want to get inside, and unfortunately, we have done a major disservice to our pollinators by moving parasites across the world at a rate that is staggering. Now, we've been doing this a lot as a result of global travel. Traveling around the world, people oftentimes will bring some fruit with them. They will try to get things into the country that customs doesn't want them to get into the country. There is a whole culture now that is just associated. There's an online subculture associated with how to get over on TSA people and get things into the country that shouldn't be there. I have frequently heard beekeepers bragging about how they got queens into the country from colonies outside of the U.S., which is a horrible idea. Please don't do it. Because those queens can come with a number of parasites and diseases that we don't already have. So parasites are a big issue. This is the small hive beetle, and that sinister face belies some adorable behaviors. They run up to bees and have somehow been able to convince them that they need to be fed. And the same behaviors that the bees will exhibit to their own baby bees, they will exhibit to these things. So they'll just feed them. It's weird. I don't fully understand what's happening, but it's a thing. As a result of the time that they're spending feeding these guys, they're spending less time feeding their own offspring, and at the same time, the hive beetle's babies are running around eating the pollen, fermenting the honey so that nothing can eat it. They release this weird viscous substance that ferments the honey, and chewing holes into the wax. So they can cause a lot of issues in the colony, and normally, if the colony is already weak, these creatures are what come in and cause the eventual collapse. But there's a worse creature than them, and it is the varroa mite, which is a huge problem, and we'll get into that a bit later. Bacteria are also a substantial issue, and our beekeeper in the room knows all about this one because there have been so many issues in the past with this pathogen, American foul brood. And American foul brood is such a sinister pathogen because it can live for a ridiculous amount of time, greater than 40 years. So if you have hive equipment that's been contaminated with spores from American foul brood, decades upon decades upon decades, you can leave that sitting in your shed and then decide to use it again, and it springs to life and destroys your entire colony. It turns the bees into mush, just a little bit of soup at the bottom of the cell, and that soup is incredibly infectious and spreads spores to the rest of the colony that kill everything. We don't have anything that can control them. They are still, to this day, the most uncontrollable issue of honeybees. And all that you really can do at that point is to dig a hole, push your colonies inside, and set them on fire. That is what's prescribed for you to do if you get American foul brood. It's a sad day. But we found that bacteria are also a huge issue for our native bees as well. And there hasn't been nearly enough study on this subject, but we know that there are several bacterial infections that our native bees can get. And as more and more bacteria are moved between countries, there are more issues that they have to deal with now that they've never had to deal with before. In addition, there are fungi, intestinal fungi like Nosema, that will get into the digestive system of the bees. They will evert this weird polar tube that they shoot out of the front of the spore that goes into the digestive tract, the digestive cells of the bee, and will just kind of blow them up. They start gestating more and more and more spores until the cell pops and releases all the spores into the digestive system. They're passed with the fecal matter of the bee, and as bees come to clean up the mess that was left by other bees who can no longer control their bowels, then they become infected as well. So it is an incredibly infectious issue, and at this point, a large majority of the colonies in the US have Nosema, which is this parasite that I was just describing. However, they can also transmit Nosema to native bees. We found it in populations of bumblebees. We also know at this point that the bumblebees have their own Nosema, as do some other native pollinators. Viruses. Now, there is not quite enough study to show that viruses are not a problem for native bees, but of all the things that they face, viruses seem to be one of the larger issues for our honeybees than they are for our native pollinators. And one of the reasons for that is what I described earlier. When you get sick, you can easily give that to the rest of your nestmates. One of the problems with viruses is that a lot of times the infections can be asymptomatic while you are still able to spread it. And so the bees may not know that they're sick, they may not know that hive immunity is necessary, and they can spread that to the rest of the colony. Pesticides. Now, pesticides, of course, are an issue. And while they've sucked up all the air in the room, they deserve to suck up some of that air because they are very problematic in a number of ways. There are the neonicotinoids, which are problematic to the bees, but something that we really need to give more thought to is the complexity of different kinds of toxins that we expose our bees to. Because we know that in certain levels, neonicotinoids are not lethal to the bees. But we don't know at what levels they are lethal to the bees after they have been exposed to other pesticides and other fungicides and other herbicides in their diet. And they are exposed to this on a constant basis. And it seems like the native pollinators are dealing more heavily with the pesticides than our honeybees are. And it is doing a lot to decimate their populations in ways that seem silent at this point because there just aren't a lot of people talking about it. Furthermore, land management is an issue. It might sound a bit surprising, but sometimes we need to let the land burn a little bit because it's those small burns that clear the brush and allow for the growth of certain plants that are very important to the bees. And it's also those small burns that clear out the fuel so that you don't get the gigantic car fires like we've seen in California and all of these huge fires that take so much work to recover from. Also, some of the issues with our land management are the fact that we plant monocultures all day, every day. And if the bees are getting sort of the lion's share of their nutrition from the diversity of pollen that they're able to be exposed to, it's one of the worst things that you can do to only expose them to just one kind of pollen. Bees are actually able to detect when they're sick and do things to amend that by collecting certain kinds of pollen and resin from the environment that they can use to self-medicate. But when we've planted so many crops that have the exact same nutritional profile and the exact same set of oils and resins, the bees aren't able to self-medicate in ways that they would naturally, and they succumb to their issues. Poor nutrition is an issue for both our native bees and for the honeybees. And that poor nutrition issue stems from exactly what I was talking about earlier. So, probably don't need to labor that point anymore. They need better food. Inbreeding is a bigger issue for our honeybees than it is for our native bees. We have a very small number of queen breeders in the US who sell queens to most of the beekeepers in the entire United States. It is a very small number of them. As a result of that, we have a very low level of genetic diversity in our honeybee colonies. And if you think of genetic diversity a lot like a tool chest, all the different tools that you have to solve a particular problem that you run into biologically, the smaller your tool chest, the fewer issues you can deal with. Well, their genetics is their tool chest. And we have given them a very small tool chest to deal with a plethora of issues. I get a little bit nervous telling people about that sometimes because it seems to embolden people to attempt to bring queens from other countries into this one. Please don't do that. That's not what I'm saying. We do need to be more okay with allowing for the genetics that are naturally present in the environment to be integrated into our colony, to allow those bees to raise their own queens, to allow for people who have queens in different areas to allow those genetics to establish and then distribute queens in their region, rather than getting them all from the southern United States, which is where most of them come from. And climate change. Climate change is actually a bigger issue for our native bees than it is for our honeybees. And one of the reasons would be that a lot of these native bees are dependent on a specific flower or a specific group of flowers. You have your squash bees, and you can guess they love squash. They love squash and any of the gourds. A lot of our native bees, our solitary bees, have a connection to one specific group of plants. And those plants bloom at a very specific time. So when as a result of climate change, they don't get the right phenological data to wake up when they need to wake up from their winter slumber, or they wake up too early because it was a much warmer winter than it should have been. They wake up earlier than when the plants actually bloom. And as a result of their biology being attuned to that specific set of plants, a lot of these organisms can actually starve to death as a result of not being exposed to the plants that they need. In addition, several of them need those plants in order to finish their life cycle, in order to reproduce. And so we have a system now where, for a lot of them, their biological clock is entirely thrown off. It's very difficult for them to get back on pace because every year is totally different from the last. There is no consistency as a result of our rapidly shifting climate. Now, I wish it weren't the case that climate change had become a political term. I don't know exactly how that happened, but it did at some point. We need to shift things back to that simply being a scientific term. This is a term that's describing something that's happening to our climate every day. Regardless of your political leanings, we still have to deal with this. And it may be a big issue for us, having crazy winters where we're shoveling 4 feet of snow where we've never shoveled it before, but it's an even bigger issue for them. And socioeconomic factors. Anybody want to guess how that impacts the bees? All right, I got you. So socioeconomic factors are a much larger issue for the honeybees than they will probably ever be for the native bees. And a big reason for that is because keeping honeybees is a lot more expensive than it used to be. As a result of the introduction of all of these different parasites, as a result of all the different pesticides that bees are exposed to, it takes more money for you to keep your colonies alive and more money for you to constantly replace the 1/3 to 50% of your colonies that you lose every year. So as a result of that, the demographic of individuals keeping honeybees has changed a lot. I speak to a lot of groups about honeybees pretty much every month. And oftentimes, there's a very distinctive demographic of individuals that I speak to. They are all older, retired white men. And no offense, I love old retired white men. You guys are great. I'm serious, you guys are great. But it's an issue to me because while I'm used to being the only brown person in the room for a lot of the work that I do, I would love to see some more brown people. And as long as we have a system where these colonies are much more of a money sink than they are giving back to you, oftentimes it just doesn't seem like a good usage of your time and money. And so one of the reasons why I would really love to save the bees is to see more people like me keeping them. That'd be pretty cool, in my opinion at least. So now I'm going to give you guys some ideas about what you can do to help the bees.